In the darkest depths of the Cold War, when two superpowers glared at each other across the barbed wire divide of ideology and nuclear might, a sleek and ghostly aircraft took to the skies in search of the truth, an unblinking eye sent to pierce the iron veil of secrecy draped over the Soviet Union. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane, codenamed the Dragon Lady, wasn't built to fight. It wasn't built for speed or agility. It was built for one purpose only: to fly higher than anything else in the sky and to see everything below with terrifying clarity. It was a technological ghost, a fragile, glider-like jet forged in silence and secrecy, designed to operate where no aircraft had gone before, above 70,000 feet at the edge of space, above the reach of enemy fighters, missiles, and even the weather. But on May 1st, 1960, the illusion of invincibility shattered like glass. That day, a U-2 flown by CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down by the Soviet Union while deep in its airspace. Powers survived the crash, was captured, and paraded before the world by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In one moment, a mission of shadows had become a public disaster. It sparked one of the greatest diplomatic crises of the Cold War, a dramatic unraveling of international trust at a time when the world was already balanced precariously on the edge of mutual annihilation. To understand how it all came to this, one must go back to the early 1950s, a time of fear, suspicion, and uncertainty. The Korean War had ended in a bloody stalemate. Stalin was dead, but his legacy lived on in the iron grip of the Soviet state. Across the globe, the struggle between capitalism and communism simmered just beneath the surface, ready to boil over in Berlin, in Vietnam, and in the halls of the United Nations. But the greatest fear in Washington was not ideological, it was strategic. It was the bomb. The Soviet Union had shocked the world in 1949 by detonating its first atomic weapon, years ahead of what Western experts had predicted. Just a few years later, they detonated a hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear monster more powerful than anything the U.S. had yet fielded. The question began to haunt the Pentagon. What else were the Soviets building? Were they developing intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking American cities from thousands of miles away? How many bombers did they have? Were they preparing for a surprise attack? The United States, blinded by the Iron Curtain, had no reliable answers. Spy satellites didn't exist yet, not in any operational form. Aerial photography by conventional reconnaissance aircraft was limited and risky. American agents on the ground were few and far between, their access severely limited, their lives always in danger. Intelligence reports were fragmented, contradictory, and often misleading. The threat of a bomber gap, and later a missile gap, gripped the public imagination and fueled calls for greater defense spending. But without hard data, the U.S. couldn't determine whether it was falling behind or simply flying blind. Enter the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA, still a relatively young organization formed after World War II, took on the challenge with a combination of urgency and audacity. In secret collaboration with Lockheed's Skunk Works, a small, ultra-secret design division led by the brilliant and maverick engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, they envisioned a new kind of aircraft, one that could fly higher than any known plane, one that could cross entire continents and return with photographic intelligence so detailed that it could reveal the length of a missile, the serial number on a crate, or the position of a radar dish. The result was the U-2. From the moment it left the drawing board, the U-2 defied expectation. It was delicate, almost spindly, with wings so long and thin they bent under their own weight. Its fuselage was unpressurized, forcing pilots to wear bulky pressure suits like astronauts. But those wings carried it higher than any Soviet fighter could reach. At cruising altitude, the U-2 flew above 70,000 feet, so high that the curvature of the Earth was visible, and the sky turned from blue to black. It was a machine designed for one purpose: surveillance at the highest altitude possible with no weapons and no defenses. It carried cameras developed by Perkin-Elmer that could photograph entire cities in a single pass, capturing details smaller than a foot from miles above. The first operational U-2 flights began in 1956, and their success was immediate. From the skies above Eastern Europe, the U-2 revealed hidden Soviet air bases, nuclear test sites, missile development facilities, and military installations never before seen by the West. It confirmed that the much-feared bomber gap was a myth. There were no legions of long-range Soviet bombers preparing for a first strike. Later missions would also debunk the idea of a missile gap. The Soviet ICBM program, while real, was not as advanced as the Kremlin wanted the world to believe. This intelligence was invaluable. It prevented unnecessary escalation, shaped defense policy, and reassured American leaders that they were not about to be blindsided by nuclear fire. But the missions came at a cost. The Soviet Union was well aware that something was happening in its skies. They could occasionally track the U-2 on radar, though they had no weapons capable of reaching it. Publicly, Khrushchev raged about violations of Soviet sovereignty. Privately, his air defense forces scrambled to find a way to bring the elusive spy plane down. Soviet engineers and their allies began developing new weapons, high-speed interceptor aircraft and advanced surface-to-air missile systems, particularly the feared S-75 Divina, known in NATO as the SA-2 guideline. It was this missile, armed with a proximity-fused warhead and guided by increasingly sophisticated radar, that would eventually seal the U-2's fate. By 1960, tensions were rising once again. A critical summit between Khrushchev and President Dwight D. Eisenhower was planned for May. Both sides hoped to reduce tensions and perhaps even forge a path toward nuclear arms control. But just days before the meeting, the CIA authorized another U-2 overflight, one of the riskiest to date. This mission, flown by pilot Francis Gary Powers, was to cross nearly the entire Soviet Union, photographing missile sites deep in Siberia before exiting near the eastern coast. But something went wrong. As Powers flew over Sverdlovsk, Soviet radar locked onto the aircraft. A salvo of SA-2 missiles was launched. One of them detonated near the U-2, not directly hitting the aircraft, but causing massive structural damage. Powers bailed out and parachuted into Soviet hands. Unlike previous pilots who had been instructed to take cyanide if captured, Powers was taken alive. His aircraft, though damaged, was also largely recovered. The secrecy of the U-2 program was no more. The Eisenhower administration initially claimed the plane had been a weather research aircraft that strayed off course. But Khrushchev, with calculated theatrical flair, waited until the U.S. doubled down on the lie, then revealed that both the pilot and the wreckage were in Soviet custody. The diplomatic backlash was swift and brutal. The Paris summit collapsed. Khrushchev stormed out. Eisenhower's credibility was damaged, and the fragile hope for de-escalation was buried beneath a cloud of mistrust. The U-2 incident had shown that even the highest flights of American technology could be brought down by the evolving defenses of the Soviet Union. It marked a turning point in Cold War espionage, one that accelerated the push for space-based reconnaissance satellites and ushered in a new era of intelligence gathering from orbit. But more than that, it served as a grim reminder that in the twilight war between East and West, even silence at 70,000 feet could end in fire and fallout. By 1956, the invisible war above the clouds had begun in earnest. As Cold War tensions solidified into a permanent geopolitical standoff, the United States launched a secret campaign of high-altitude espionage over Soviet territory using a weapon so unusual and advanced that it seemed plucked from the pages of science fiction. The U-2, with its impossibly long wings and alien silhouette, could glide at the edge of space, silently snapping photographs of the world's most heavily guarded secrets. Its creation had been a triumph of American ingenuity. But what followed was not just a tale of engineering brilliance, it was a story of human risk, political peril, and a tragic miscalculation. The Central Intelligence Agency, operating with full backing from the Eisenhower administration, assembled a cadre of elite pilots to fly these dangerous missions. They were carefully screened, psychologically evaluated, and trained not only to fly at extreme altitudes, but to do so alone, for hours at a time, in total radio silence over the most hostile terrain on Earth. These men had to be more than just skilled. They had to be composed, unflinching, and completely committed to secrecy. One of them was Francis Gary Powers. Powers wasn't flashy. He was a quiet, methodical man from Virginia, a veteran of the U.S. Air Force with extensive experience flying high-performance aircraft. What set him apart was his calmness under pressure and his meticulous attention to procedure, qualities the CIA valued in a pilot who might one day have to fly alone across a continent where even the air itself was an enemy. He was sworn to secrecy, even from his own family. Officially, he didn't exist. Unofficially, he was one of the most important assets in America's shadow war. The stakes could not have been higher. With tensions rising and Khrushchev's rhetoric growing more aggressive by the day, the United States needed concrete intelligence on Soviet capabilities, rumors of vast missile fields, hidden bomber bases, and advanced nuclear research facilities terrified policymakers in Washington. Some of it was bluster, but they didn't know how much. Each U-2 mission was designed to answer those questions, to peel back the layers of mystery that cloaked the USSR's military-industrial complex. Despite the risk, early missions seemed to validate the U-2's promise. It flew so high, above 70,000 feet, that Soviet fighters couldn't reach it. The CIA assured everyone involved that even if the plane was spotted on radar, there was nothing the Soviets could do to stop it. The aircraft was invisible in every way that mattered, or so they believed. By 1960, that belief was beginning to unravel. Unbeknownst to the CIA and its pilots, Soviet air defenses were evolving. Radar technology was improving, missile systems were being upgraded and deployed across the country, and the U-2 had flown too many missions. The Soviets were watching, learning, adapting. The veil of invincibility was thinning, and the illusion of immunity was crumbling. Still, the CIA pressed forward, hungry for more data. Another summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev was on the horizon, and hard intelligence on Soviet missile deployments was considered critical. A final, ambitious mission was approved. The date was May 1, 1960, May Day, the biggest holiday on the Soviet calendar, a day when the military paraded its power through the streets of Moscow and the skies were filled with patriotic fervor. It was also, the CIA reasoned, a day when Soviet air defenses might be distracted or operating on reduced alert. It was the perfect cover, or so it seemed. That morning, Francis Gary Powers climbed into his aircraft at a remote CIA base in Peshawar, Pakistan. The mission ahead of him was one of the most complex and dangerous ever attempted. He would fly northeast across the Soviet Union, capturing images of high-priority targets, missile launch facilities hidden in the Ural Mountains, nuclear test sites, research centers, and, most provocatively, the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the nerve center of the Soviet space program and missile development efforts. His final destination was Bodo, Norway. The preparations were meticulous. Powers wore a pressurized flight suit that resembled something out of NASA, designed to protect him at extreme altitudes where the atmosphere was too thin to breathe. He carried a standard emergency kit, a sidearm, maps, a compass, food rations, and, chillingly, a poison-laced pin hidden in a coin designed to give him a quick, painless death if capture seemed imminent. He was also briefed on the aircraft's self-destruct system, which could be activated in flight or on the ground, to destroy sensitive components. But Powers had doubts about the system's reliability. More than once, he questioned its effectiveness. But the mission was on. The Dragon Lady soared into the air before dawn, climbing higher and higher until the stars became visible even though it was morning. Below him, the Soviet Union unspooled like a vast frozen tapestry. Forests, mountains, rivers, cities. His cameras clicked away silently, recording everything with precision lenses the Soviets could only dream of. But far below, Soviet radar stations had already spotted him. This wasn't the first U-2 they'd tracked, but it was the first they had a real chance of shooting down. Near the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, the Soviet military launched a barrage of S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missiles. These were the new generation of Soviet SAMs, fast and deadly, guided by powerful radar systems that could follow targets even at extreme altitudes. One of the missiles detonated close enough to Powers' U-2 to tear off a wing. The plane spiraled out of control, disintegrating as it fell from the heavens. Somehow, Powers survived. He ejected, his parachute deploying in time, and drifted down into the hands of the Soviet military. Bleeding, dazed, and fully aware of the implications of his capture, Powers was taken into custody. He had not activated the self-destruct. He had not used the poison pin. And when the Soviets recovered the wreckage, they found it remarkably intact, including its cameras and exposed film. The United States, unaware that Powers had survived and that the Soviets had the wreckage, issued a cover story. A weather research plane had gone off course, they claimed. Navigation error, mechanical failure, a tragic accident. But the Soviets waited. Let the Americans lie first, Khrushchev thought. Then reveal the truth. When they did, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. The mission that had been designed to give the United States leverage in a summit with the Soviet Union instead handed the Kremlin a propaganda windfall. Eisenhower was forced to admit that the U.S. had been conducting illegal surveillance over Soviet territory. Khrushchev canceled the summit in dramatic fashion. Powers was paraded in front of television cameras. His trial, a spectacle designed to humiliate the United States. The U-2 incident wasn't just a blown mission. It was a turning point in Cold War strategy, a moment when the illusion of technological superiority was pierced and the costs of secrecy laid bare for the world to see. France's Gary Powers would eventually return home in a spy swap, but his flight on that fateful May day would forever mark the end of one era of espionage and the beginning of another. Unknown to the CIA and American defense planners, the Soviet Union had, in the months prior, significantly upgraded its radar networks and air defense infrastructure. Long-range radars with improved resolution now dotted vast stretches of Soviet territory, forming a lethal web that scanned the upper atmosphere. Even more critically, the Soviets had begun deploying a new and terrifyingly effective weapon, the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile system, codenamed SA-2 Guideline by NATO. These were no longer theoretical threats. They were operational. And on May 1, 1960, as France's Gary Powers flew his U-2 spy plane on what was meant to be a routine but vital mission, he was entering a far more hostile and capable environment than any previous pilot had faced. From the moment Powers crossed into Soviet airspace near the southern border, Soviet radar operators began tracking him. The altitude of the U-2, once thought untouchable, was no longer a sanctuary. Moving steadily across the expanse of Soviet territory, Powers followed his flight plan, photographing missile installations, industrial centers, and sensitive military targets. He remained unaware that he was being watched, plotted, and calculated by a network of command posts and missile batteries that had orders to shoot him down at all costs. As he approached the city of Sverdlovsk, a heavily fortified industrial and military hub in the central Ural region, the order was given. Soviet air defense forces launched a coordinated barrage. Multiple S-75 missiles soared skyward, each traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. Guided by radar and designed to destroy targets flying at the very edge of Earth's atmosphere. One of the missiles exploded near Powers' aircraft. The shockwave from the blast did not directly strike the fuselage, but it didn't need to. The resulting concussive force tore off part of the U-2's long, delicate tail, sending the aircraft into a violent spin. Inside the cockpit, Powers was slammed against the sides as the aircraft pitched and tumbled, altitude bleeding away. He fought to regain control, but the U-2 was not designed for maneuverability or rapid descent. The thin air that had cradled it in the upper stratosphere became suddenly turbulent and hostile as the damaged plane plunged. Powers realized he had no choice. He reached for the destruct switch to trigger the onboard self-destruction mechanism designed to vaporize the sensitive camera systems and intelligence-gathering equipment. But it was too late, or perhaps the system failed as he had long feared. There was no time. He was being thrown around inside the cockpit, struggling just to stay conscious. At approximately 34,000 feet, Powers ejected. His parachute deployed successfully. He floated downward into a quiet patchwork of farmland and forests. The Soviet Union loomed vast and silent beneath him. He was alive, bruised but intact. His pressure suit flapped in the wind as he descended into a remote area near Sverdlovsk, not far from the missile impact site. Below him, the landscape rolled out in waves of green fields and muddy roads. Within minutes of landing, he was surrounded, not by Soviet soldiers, but by bewildered farmers and local militia who had watched the sky erupt and seen the flaming wreckage fall. He was quickly apprehended. Within hours, Powers was in the custody of the KGB. Soviet agents swarmed the crash site and began recovering wreckage. They were astonished at what they found. The U-2's sensitive equipment had survived in surprisingly good condition. Powerful cameras, exposed rolls of film, navigation instruments, and electronic surveillance devices were all there. Tangible proof of espionage, captured almost entirely intact. What began as a high-risk intelligence mission had now become a geopolitical nightmare. Back in Washington, the CIA and the Eisenhower administration had no idea Powers had survived. All previous U-2s that had encountered trouble had disintegrated or gone down over less sensitive areas. The working assumption was that Powers had died in the crash and that the aircraft had been destroyed, either by the missile blast or the pilot's self-destruct sequence. Believing the mission to be unrecoverable and unaware that the Soviets had retrieved the wreckage and the pilot, American officials crafted a story they believed would be sufficient to defuse any international incident. On May 3rd, a press release was issued. The United States claimed that a NASA research aircraft, conducting high-altitude weather studies, had gone off course after the pilot experienced an oxygen failure. The statement emphasized that the plane was likely lost and presumed destroyed. It was a carefully worded, plausible explanation designed to explain a potential radar track while preserving deniability. The hope was that the Soviets either hadn't recovered anything substantial or would accept the story and avoid escalating tensions. But in the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev was preparing a different move. The Soviet leader, never one to miss a dramatic opportunity, had been briefed in detail. He had the pilot, he had the wreckage, he had the film, and most of all, he had the advantage. But instead of immediately revealing the truth, Khrushchev chose patience. For several days, the Soviet Union said nothing publicly. They watched the international press circulate America's cover story. They let U.S. officials repeat the narrative on camera, reassure allies, and attempt to downplay the incident. Then, on May 5, 1960, Khrushchev struck. Standing before the Supreme Soviet, with the world's press present, he calmly announced that a U.S. spy plane had been shot down over the heart of the Soviet Union. Not only had it been captured, its pilot had survived. The story was false, the evidence undeniable. Khrushchev held the world's attention as he unveiled photographs of the wreckage, images taken from the U-2's camera rolls, and personal items belonging to Powers. The trap had been sprung. The announcement sent shockwaves through the international community. U.S. allies were stunned. The American public was blindsided. President Eisenhower and the CIA had been caught in a lie, and the damage was immediate. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts gloated with triumphant headlines. In Western capitals, trust in American transparency took a hit, and in Moscow, the stage was set for a trial that would become a propaganda spectacle and a turning point in the Cold War. The U-2 incident was no longer just a failed reconnaissance flight. It was a global crisis, and one that would bring the Cold War to one of its most dangerous rhetorical peaks. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and explosive. The United States was caught red-handed. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was forced to admit that the U.S. had authorized high-altitude reconnaissance missions over the USSR for the sake of national security. Khrushchev, furious but politically astute, seized the opportunity to embarrass the U.S. on the world stage. He canceled a planned summit meeting in Paris between the U.S., USSR, UK, and France that had been intended to ease Cold War tensions. Instead of détente, the incident deepened the divide between East and West. Meanwhile, Gary Powers became the central figure in a global political drama. The Soviets charged him with espionage. His trial was a carefully staged propaganda exercise held in Moscow. Powers, dressed in a dark suit, stood behind bars in a packed courtroom. Soviet prosecutors painted him as a tool of American aggression, while Powers, calm and composed, admitted that he was flying a spy mission, but insisted he was only following orders. He showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to 10 years, 3 in prison and 7 in a labor camp. Back in the United States, Powers' fate sparked debate. Some viewed him as a hero who had risked his life for national security. Others questioned why he had failed to activate the aircraft's self-destruct and why he hadn't taken the suicide pin. The CIA, wary of damaging leaks, remained largely silent. Powers' family suffered through the media scrutiny and uncertainty about his fate. For nearly 2 years, Powers languished in Soviet custody, enduring harsh conditions and interrogations, but refusing to betray classified information. In early 1962, behind-the-scenes negotiations began to secure his release. The Soviet Union held Powers, but the United States had something of equal value: Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy captured by the FBI in 1957. After delicate diplomatic maneuvering, the two nations agreed to an exchange. The swap was arranged to take place on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, a location that would become legendary as the Bridge of Spies,